Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
I sat in disbelief as the events unfolded before my eyes. The annual Homeowners Association meeting had started like any other, with the usual pleasantries and small talk among neighbors. But as soon as the topic of electing new board members came up, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. "We'll now move on to the results of the board member election," announced Martha, the current HOA president, her voice dripping with an air of superiority that made my skin crawl. She nodded to a man I didn't recognize, who stood up and cleared his throat. "As the representative of the new organization handling the HOA's affairs, I'm pleased to announce the winners of the board member election," he said. His words rushed and rehearsed. In a matter of seconds, he rattled off a list of names I'd never heard before, declaring them the new board members. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened. The votes hadn't even been opened. The sealed envelopes containing the mail-in ballots sat untouched on the table in front of Martha, including a few that had arrived late but were still within the acceptable time frame. "Wait a minute," I called out, rising to my feet. "Shouldn't we actually count the votes?" Martha's eyes narrowed as she looked at me. "The votes have been tallied, and the results have been announced. We're moving on to the next item on the agenda." A murmur of discontent rippled through the room. I glanced around, seeing confusion and anger on many faces. Mrs. Johnson, a sweet 85-year-old who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, leaned over to me. "Dear, what's happening? I thought we were supposed to see the votes being counted," she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I patted her hand reassuringly. "You're right, Mrs. Johnson. That's how it's supposed to work." Before I could say anything else, Bob, the local busybody who always seemed to side with the board, stood up. "I'd like to take a moment to commend the board for their excellent work over the past year," he announced, his voice overly enthusiastic. "They've really turned things around for our community." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if we were living in two different realities. The board had been nothing but a source of frustration and conflict for most of us, implementing arbitrary rules and raising fees without explanation. "Excuse me," called out Mr. Ramirez, an elderly gentleman who'd been dealing with health issues. "I wasn't able to submit a mail-in ballot due to my recent hospitalization. Could I cast my vote now?" Martha's response was swift and cold. "I'm sorry, but we can only accept the mail-in ballots that were submitted on time. No exceptions." "But that's not fair," I protested. "Mr. Ramirez was in the hospital. Surely we can make an accommodation. Rules are rules," Martha replied, her tone final. "Now let's move on to discussing the new landscaping proposals." That was the last straw for many of us. Without a word, about half the room stood up and began filing out. I watched in a mixture of anger and sadness as my neighbors, many of them elderly and clearly upset, left the meeting in silent protest. As I gathered my things to leave, I caught sight of Mrs. Peterson, a 91-year-old resident who couldn't make it to the meeting. I remembered her calling me earlier, asking if I could represent her interests at the meeting. Now I felt like I had let her down. Outside the meeting room, a small group had gathered, talking in hushed, angry tones. "Can you believe what just happened in there?" asked Tom, a middle-aged man who lived down the street from me. I shook my head. "It's unbelievable. They didn't even pretend to count the votes. What can we do about it?" asked Wendy, a young mother who'd moved in last year. "Is there someone we can report this to?" I sighed, feeling the weight of frustration settling on my shoulders. "I'm not sure. The problem is, many of our older residents are too tired or unwell to fight this. And the rest of us, well, we're just worn down by all the constant battles with the board. But we can't just let them get away with this," Tom insisted. "There have to be laws against this kind of thing." "There probably are," I agreed. "But fighting it would take time, money, and energy that a lot of us just don't have right now." As we stood there, I saw Mr. Chen, one of our oldest residents, slowly making his way towards his car. His shoulders were slumped and he looked defeated. I excused myself from the group and hurried over to him. "Mr. Chen, are you okay? Can I help you to your car?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Thank you, but I can manage. I've lived here for 40 years, you know. I never thought I'd see the day when our community would come to this." His words hit me hard. I'd only been living here for 5 years, but in that time I'd watched the neighborhood change. What was once a close-knit community had become fractured and distrustful, largely due to the actions of the HOA board. "I understand, Mr. Chen. It's not right what's happening," he nodded slowly. "No, it's not, but what can we do? At my age, I don't have the energy to fight anymore. And my wife, she's not well. We can't risk losing our home over this." I helped him into his car, my heart heavy. As I watched him drive away, I couldn't help but think about all the other elderly residents in our community. People like Mrs. Peterson, who couldn't even make it to the meeting. People who had invested their lives in this neighborhood, only to see it taken over by a group that seemed to care more about power than community. Walking back to my own car, I ran into Lisa, another neighbor who had left the meeting early. "Hey," she said, her voice low. "A few of us are thinking about meeting up later to discuss what happened. Are you interested?" I nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. Where and when?" "My place, around 7 p.m. We'll try to keep it quiet. Don't want the board's spies getting wind of it." The fact that we had to sneak around like this in our own neighborhood made my blood boil, but I understood the necessity. "I'll be there," I promised. As I drove home, my mind was racing. How had things gotten this bad? And more importantly, what could we do about it? The board seemed to be operating with impunity, ignoring rules and steamrolling over anyone who dared to question them. I thought about the unopened ballots left on the table, the voices of our community silenced without even a pretense of being heard. I thought about Mr. Ramirez, denied his right to vote because of a hospital stay, and I thought about Mrs. Peterson, unable to attend and now unrepresented. The more I dwelled on it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about an HOA overstepping its bounds anymore. This was about the very fabric of our community being torn apart. It was about the vulnerable members of our neighborhood being taken advantage of, their voices silenced. As I pulled into my driveway, I made a decision. I didn't know exactly how yet, but something had to change. We couldn't let this continue. For the sake of Mr. Chen, Mrs. Peterson, and all the others who couldn't fight for themselves, we had to find a way to stand up to this board. I checked my watch. 3 hours until the meeting at Lisa's. 3 hours to gather my thoughts, to try and come up with some kind of plan. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be quick, but we had to start somewhere. As I walked into my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult battle. But as I thought about my neighbors, about the community we once had and could have again, I knew it was a battle worth fighting. The next few hours passed in a blur of research and phone calls. I dug out our HOA bylaws, searching for any clause that might help us challenge the board's actions. I called a friend who worked as a paralegal, picking her brain about potential legal avenues we could pursue. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, I had a notebook full of scribbled ideas and a determination that had only grown stronger. I arrived at Lisa's house to find a small group already gathered in her living room. Tom and Wendy were there, along with a few other neighbors I recognized from the meeting. Lisa ushered me in quickly, closing the door behind me and drawing the curtains. "Glad you could make it," she said, her voice hushed. "We were just getting started." As I took a seat, I looked around the room. The faces I saw were a mix of anger, frustration, and fear. These were people who had been pushed to their limits, who felt cornered in their own homes by an organization that was supposed to protect their interests. "So," Tom began, leaning forward in his chair, "what are we going to do about this?" The room fell silent for a moment, everyone looking at each other uncertainly. It was clear that while we all knew something needed to be done, none of us were quite sure where to start. I cleared my throat. "I've been doing some research," I said, opening my notebook. "There are a few potential avenues we could pursue." Over the next hour, we discussed various options. Legal action was a possibility, but it would be expensive and time-consuming. We could try to rally more of the community to our cause, but many were too afraid or apathetic to get involved. We even considered the drastic step of trying to dissolve the HOA entirely, though that seemed like a long shot. As the discussion wore on, frustration began to mount. Every potential solution seemed to have a dozen obstacles in its path. "This is hopeless," Wendy sighed, slumping back in her seat. "They hold all the cards. How are we supposed to fight this?" I understood her despair, but I couldn't let it take hold. "We can't give up," I insisted. "Think about Mr. Chen, about Mrs. Peterson. They can't fight this battle, but we can. We have to, for their sake." Lisa nodded in agreement. "He's right. We owe it to our community to at least try." Slowly, the mood in the room began to shift. Despair gave way to determination, hopelessness to resolve. We might not have had all the answers, but we had each other, and we had a cause worth fighting for. As the meeting wound down, we agreed to each take on specific tasks. Tom would look into legal options, Wendy would start quietly reaching out to other neighbors to gauge support, and I would dig deeper into the HOA bylaws to find any leverage we could use. Before we left, Lisa spoke up one last time. "Remember," she said, her voice low but firm, "we need to be careful. The board has shown they're not above breaking rules. We don't know how far they'll go to maintain control." Her words sent a chill through the room. but they also strengthened our resolve. This wasn't just about an unfair election anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, about protecting our community from those who would exploit it. As I drove home that night, my mind was racing with plans and possibilities. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. We were up against a group that had already shown they were willing to ignore rules and steamroll over opposition. But for the first time since the disastrous meeting earlier that day, I felt a glimmer of hope. We might be underdogs in this fight, but we had something the board didn't: a genuine love for our community and a determination to do what was right. It might take time, it might be an uphill battle, but we weren't going to let them win without a fight. As I pulled into my driveway, I caught sight of Mr. Chen's house across the street. The lights were off, but I could imagine him inside, perhaps worrying about the future of the home he'd lived in for 4 decades. In that moment, my resolve hardened even further. This wasn't just about rules and regulations anymore. This was about people, about community, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, I knew we had to keep fighting, for Mr. Chen, for Mrs. Peterson, for all of us. The battle had just begun, and we were ready for it. Pretty sure Arizona has decent laws around transparency and disclosure, so you should be able, once you figure out the process, to request the ballot evidence, which presumably they'll fake. The problem is doing much to the board if you aren't able to get the members on your side. Seems like there are enough to force a recall vote, if you can get them to coordinate rather than just walk out. Let me make a few suggestions. With many red flags flying already, I found there was way more votes than even possible in one of our elections. I did nothing about it then, but I realized that all member questions answered by "it's in our bylaws" or "it's state law." I vowed to learn, so it was my bedtime reading. And better than any sleeping pill, I highly recommend it. As a bonus, I now know all of that, at least all well as they do, but really I know them better. I found that I could have disputed the election for more than one reason, but I only had 60 days. I did not do that, but I also found that as a member I was entitled to the voter sign-in sheets, and post-election even the ballots. If you can prove wrongdoing in their process as outlined in their governing documents, you can file for arbitration. You have to make sure you have a good case, as the losing party pays attorney fees. Even if you let it go, knowledge is power. Learn it and use it. The rules regarding elections should be clearly outlined in the CC&R's bylaws. Typically, there are specific dates, times that ballots are required to be received by in order to be counted, and, at least the way the bylaws have been written where I live, in order to even open them, there has to be a quorum of votes of a specific percentage of homeowners. If that quorum isn't met, the ballots aren't opened or counted, and the board carries over from the previous year.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.